I didn't even realize this rabbit hole existed, and now I know what I want for Christmas. Today, we're gonna go down a very unusual rabbit hole that was not on my YouTuber bingo card at all, because it spawned from the rare occasion of new internet drama actually landing not only within my limited window of the internet, but also inside my field of expertise. Somebody thought an outfit they were seeing was something from World War II Germany, and while that was turning into this big dumpster fire, my history nerd brain was trying to figure out where they got that idea. So I went down this very specific rabbit hole of black military uniforms in German history. Turns out not only did soldiers in black uniforms show up in German history over a century before the No Nuts Party was even noticeable, but they also created the entire inspiration for the modern German flag, which is already awesome. But then the autism kicked in, and a mildly connected thought occurred to me. How did uniforms, including black ones, become something people wore because they wanted to, not because they had to? So I went down another rabbit hole, this time with help. And ironically, that answer starts right where Germany leaves off, with America tanning their hides 30 shades of purple. The same manufacturing might that beat the Germans reshaped fashion forever after, and now I have a bunch of ideas for what to put on a holiday wish list for the rest of my time on Earth. Much like any story with this caliber of wild take, this one starts on Twitter. Yes, I know it's X, but Twitter rolls off the tongue better, and I'm both lazy and Northeastern, which means I say as little as possible, as fast as possible, because I got things to do. Now, I generally limit my Twitter viewing to those spaces that are immediately relevant to me, so anime and things that make you go boom in the night, because every passing day the world seems to wake up and say,
"Is it on fire?"
It could be more on fire.
And I don't want to look at that. But that doesn't always keep the dumpster fires off my front lawn, and recently I discovered somebody making the claim that a bigger streamer was wearing World War II German fashion. So I, being the history nerd that I am, I start asking questions, and the first thing I do is look at the uniform. It looks nothing like a World War II German uniform. The stitching is wrong, the buttons are wrong, even the emblems on the cap are wrong. The only thing in common is that it's black. And so the first question that comes to my mind is, where did this idea come from? And then I stopped and went, wait a minute, where did this idea come from? Where did the idea come from that black military uniforms are specifically a World War II Germany thing? Because I can vaguely remember Waffen-SS and Panzer units wearing black uniforms, but they're not the only ones who wear black on a uniform. Special forces and counterterrorism units like India's National Security Guard and Brazil's BOPE wear black. The British SAS used to wear black. The US Army's Military Police Corps and the French Gendarmerie Nationale wear black. And even if we're just talking dress uniforms, the US Army also wore straight black instead of dark blue for a little while. In fact, the Vatican Swiss Guard just introduced a new black dress uniform for non-formal events. And that's not even counting all the uniforms that were such a dark blue that it's often confused for black. It's a pretty common color, and when you consider color psychology, yes, that's a thing, it's really no surprise. According to the Network Association of Uniform Manufacturers and Distributors, black denotes sophistication, authority, and elegance. It is frequently used in luxury brands and formal attire to project an image of exclusivity and power. And the last of those makes a lot of sense for military and police outfits because most people don't listen to authorities they don't recognize.
You have no power here!
However, there's also a reason that black is used for funerals, because it also represents death and mourning. And that's the real reason it first appeared on German military uniforms. In the 1800s. Let's travel back to 1806 in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. While Great Britain and the newborn America are slowly building towards the War of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte has been leading the armies of France into war across all of Europe for the last 6 to 8 years, in an effort to use the nationalistic momentum gained from the French Revolution to turn the country into a global empire. He started as a commanding officer during the War of the Second Coalition, starting in the last years of the 1700s and ending in 1802, where the French forces beat down a six-nation army made of Austria, Great Britain, Portugal, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Naples. This was followed by the War of the Third Coalition, which started in 1803 and saw Britain up against France and Spain. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France the following year, and the conflict escalated in 1805, when Russia and Austria entered the war on Britain's side. The Third Coalition War would see the French end up fighting another six-nation army made from the United Kingdom, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Naples, and Sicily until 1806. Although technically speaking, the fighting never ended between France and the three nations of Russia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Prussia, now alarmed by Napoleon's expansion, joined the fighting against the French alongside Saxony, a northern region of what would later become Germany. Prussia announced its participation on October 9th, 1806, and this is where the story really begins.
And today I'm going to read it to you.
Unfortunately, the Prussians were horribly outclassed and underprepared, so when Napoleon showed up 5 days later, not even a week, he swatted them aside like a fly. The Prussians basically tried to talk back to Dad and got their cans tanned at mock purple, and the Battle of Jena Auerstedt on October 14th, 1806 ended in a sound Prussian spanking. It also resulted in the death of the Duke of the Duchy of Brunswick, Charles William Ferdinand, leaving his son, Friedrich Wilhelm, in charge.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
Fast forward 3 years to 1809, when Austria, apparently not taking the hint that they'd gotten their teeth kicked in 4 times by the French, including the War of the First Coalition, came to the conclusion that the 5th time's the charm and they were gonna fight France again.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
And for whatever reason, they decided they were going to do it pretty much alone. 1 3-nation army and 2 6-nation armies didn't do the job, but by itself, I guess it will. They did manage to bring in some extra help from the United Kingdom, but there was also another ally they could recruit, the all-too-willing Duke Friedrich Wilhelm of Brunswick, who was still pissed that Napoleon killed his dad. To prepare for this attack, Duke Wilhelm pulled together a unit called the Brunswick Free Corps on April 1st, 1809, made from 1 regiment of cavalry and 2 understrength infantry battalions. These forces were placed under Austrian command, and on April 10th, 1809, Austrian forces invaded France's strongest ally, the Kingdom of Bavaria. While they did catch the French by surprise, they moved too slowly, and French forces were able to regroup. Then, after losing his first fight in 10 years in late May, Napoleon rebounded and rallied his army, winning the largest battle in European history at the time in early June. By October 14th, 1809, Austria and France had signed an armistice, and since the Austrians had persuaded Brunswick to help them, the Duchy of Brunswick was ceded to the French as part of the peace deal and incorporated into the Kingdom of Westphalia, which was a French client state made from captured and ceded Germanic territories. And this is where Duke Wilhelm decided he was going to main character that shit.
To hell with all you dirty heathen.
Because the Duke looked at that whole surrendering deal and said something to the effect of, "Oh what, my country's gone because somebody else signed it away? Too bad, that's my land, he killed my dad and I didn't hear no bell." Duke Wilhelm then proceeds to take his entire army and fight his way north, picking up even more Germanic soldiers from the captured duchies along the way and forming a 3rd Infantry Battalion. He then makes it to the northern coast, gets picked up by the British, and puts his army under their command so he can go right back to fighting Napoleon. I don't know much about Warhammer 40k besides the crippling debt it puts its players in, but to me this just sounds like the 1800s version of the Cadian Guard. Those guys kept fighting the enemies of the God Emperor of Man even after their home planet was destroyed, earning them the mantra, "The planet fell before the Guard." The Brunswick army is just the real-world version. After joining up with the British, the Brunswick Free Corps would adopt a new black uniform in mourning of the homeland they'd lost, with a skull and crossbones on their hats known as the Totenkopf, or Death's Head. Their time under British command would also see the creation of a new phrase, "Out of the blackness of servitude through bloody battles to the golden light of freedom." And this chant would actually become the inspiration for the choice of black, red, and gold colors that still live on in the current Deutschlandfahne, aka the German flag. And Duke Wilhelm wouldn't have to wait very long to get his chance for that golden light of freedom.
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
The Brunswick army would start by aiding the British on the Iberian Peninsula in 1808 during the Peninsular War to liberate Spain and Portugal from French domination. That conflict ended in British, Spanish, and Portuguese victory in 1814 and caused Napoleon's first downfall, but it also earned the Brunswick army a nickname, the Black Brunswickers, with the cavalry specifically being nicknamed the Black Hussars. After Napoleon returned in March of 1815, the alliance of Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia summoned their armies again and prepared to march on France to put Napoleon down for good. However, the march wouldn't arrive in time to stop Napoleon from regrouping and resummoning his forces, although Napoleon wouldn't be able to summon as many as he wanted because after he abdicated the throne, King Louis XVIII reached into France's admin settings and disabled conscription. This left Napoleon unable to pull together enough people until August to fight an invasion he expected in July. So instead of waiting, he decided to pull a Sun Tzu and appear strong when he was weak, and invaded the Netherlands on the 15th of June to try and take out half the nations involved before the other two could start their engines.
Surprise, motherfucker.
He would have some initial success, but when he split his forces to attack enemy formations at Quatre Bras and Ligny the next day, he failed to achieve a total victory on either front. The alliance of forces at the Battle of Quatre Bras, where the Black Brunswickers were fighting, took 4,700 casualties, only about 400 more than the French. But unfortunately, Duke Friedrich Wilhelm was among them. The Brunswickers wouldn't have to wait long to avenge their duke, though, and 2 days later, on June 18, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was finally and fully defeated. And with their homeland finally liberated, the Brunswick army would return home. There, they would remain at peace for just over 30 years until 1848 in the Austro-Prussian War. Prussia had been trying to pressure the new Duke of Brunswick, Wilhelm August Ludwig Maximilian Friedrich, who I'm now just going to call Duke Wilhelm, to join them in the war, but the Duke just didn't want to.
I don't want to. Shut up.
By the time the Prussians negotiated him into it, the fighting was basically over, and they were pretty much only there as a formality. Eventually, the Black Brunswickers would be integrated into the Prussian army as part of the North German Convention in 1867, and the then 92nd Infantry Regiment would fight next to Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War. However, Duke Wilhelm refused to sign any further military agreements with Prussia even after the German Empire was formed in 1871, resulting in no changes to the black uniforms even up to his death in 1884. However, he died childless, and so when Kaiser Wilhelm I's nephew, Prince Albrecht of Prussia, took the throne in his place, the military would finally retire the black uniforms in 1886 as they were fully integrated into the Prussian army as the Lieb Husaren regiments. But the legacy of their Brunswick service didn't disappear. When these regiments would be further integrated into the main Prussian army in 1914 for World War I, the soldiers belonging to the original 3rd Battalion would also get the Totenkopf added to their helmets, to honor the mad lad Duke Friedrich Wilhelm, who literally gave everything to give his people another chance at going home. And now we have to talk about how fascism and Nazis happened, so if you need a warning for that, there it is. Because sad as it may be, the Spicy Pinwheel Party wasn't actually the first group to ruin the idea of a black uniform. In fact, it's actually likely they got the idea to do so from the Italians and their black shirts, which were the direct cause of Stupid Mustache Face deciding to try the dictatorship game himself. After World War I ended, Italy was a chaotic mess. Unemployment was rampant, and socialist organizations were going on a lot of labor strikes to try and fight the myriad of economic issues all over the country. The various political parties were constantly divided, and if you've got socialists on one side, chances are you're going to have fascists on the other side, and Italy did. In 1918, this political party found a new leader in a power-hungry soldier returning home from World War I by the name of Benito Mussolini, who would start giving highly emotional speeches to gather people of a fascist disposition. By 1919, he had garnered enough favor to create small bands of fighters for forcibly removing socialists from the government positions and destroying any supporting organizations. Although by 1920, those actions, which effectively amounted to terrorist attacks, had expanded to targeting Catholics, communists, Republicans, trade unionists, pretty much every demographic that wasn't them. These squads wore black shirts, supposedly inspired by the ones sometimes worn by Italy's elite shock troops from the First World War, the Arditi, which earned them the nickname Black Shirts. These black shirts would go on to kill hundreds of people in political conflicts across Italy during this time period, but they were dispersed and scattered even through the formation of the National Fascist Party in 1921, leaving them unable to gain a conclusive foothold in Italy. But that changed at the rally on October 24, 1922, where Mussolini gathered thousands of black shirts and declared, "Either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome."
And we'll remember this as the last day of the Republic!
And the government didn't hand itself over to him, so he decided to march. And on October 28th, Mussolini and tens of thousands of black shirts and other followers marched on Rome. Numerous government officials resigned and fled for their lives, although initially the Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, stayed. Facta, to put it simply, was kind of a coward, and a lot of his actions in response to Mussolini went to the tune of too little too late. Even when the black shirts marched on Rome, he still hesitated to declare a state of siege despite the military and police being fully prepared to quash the movement. And then when he finally did order the military to intervene, for whatever reason, the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, refused to sign the order. So Factor resigned, and Mussolini took that opportunity to pressure the king to appoint him as the new prime minister. And that's what he did. So on October 29, 1992, the day after the March on Rome started, Mussolini became both Italy's youngest prime minister and the first leader of a fascist state in history. The black shirts under his command were formally coalesced into a national militia on February 1st, 1923, as the Voluntary Fascist Militia for National Security. And by the 1930s, the militia was converted into full-blown military units, which would be sent to fight in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War and the Spanish Civil War.
We are really scraping the bottom of the barrel here.
While that was all going on, the same political philosophy was now taking root in Germany. Germany was required to accept full responsibility for World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles mandated that they pay reparations to cover all civilian damage caused, amounting to roughly $33 billion US. Worse still, the German government had tried to keep the general public in the dark about the state of the entire war, so a lot of people had no idea they were losing until Germany surrendered. As a result, the more nationalistic members of society felt like the existing parties had embarrassed their home country by what appeared to be surrendering out of nowhere. And that extreme nationalistic sentiment, combined with widespread unemployment, culminated in the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, which most people just call the Nazis. 2 years later, in 1921, the angry painter man became the party's leader, where he began stealing Mussolini's notes to organize his own party. One of the first things he did was form a paramilitary wing of the NSDAP known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA, aka the Brown Shirts, in very clear reference to the Italian Black Shirts. Then, the following year, he decided to try copy-pasting the coup in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, or the Munich Push. Thankfully, though, he wasn't the only one taking notes on Mussolini, because German forces put a stop to that right then and there and arrested Moron Mustachio. He tried to preach his ideas on trial, which got some attention but didn't save him, and he got shoved in the barred box for a year. He wrote his little Madman book before getting out in 1924, which was published the next year, and then he announced that his party would take a legal path to power. Not ethical, legal.
You tricked me with a f***ing technicality? Seriously?
It worked, didn't it?
The Crooked Cross Princess then established his own personal bodyguard force, the infamous Schutzstaffel, or SS, as a subunit within the SA force on April 4th, 1925. These people would show up wherever Mr. Anger Issues Incarnate showed his half-grown facial flosser, and they were presumed to be the elite of his forces, at least until America came along later and proved that there was a difference between being elite and being stupid without consequence. However, the SS didn't wear what would be their distinctive black uniforms at first. They originally wore the same outfit as the Brown Shirts, but with a black hat and black tie, with the Black Brunswickers' Death's Head, Skull, and Crossbones pinned to it. The SS was officially declared subordinate to the SA on November 1st, 1926, but by the end of 1927, they had gained enough active members to declare themselves an independent unit. However, they would still keep using the brown shirt outfit until 1929, when they adopted the full black dress uniform, also supposedly based on the black uniforms of the Black Brunswickers. After that year, the Great Depression really took hold, and the economic frustrations radicalized a lot of young people into flooding the NSDAP's ranks. By 1932, the party had gained enough support to win the majority vote in the German parliament, but the government was nowhere near stable. Competition with the Communist Party, despite their combined opposition to the country's constitution, and the fact that both parties combined made up half the parliament's seats, made any voting process about as fluid as a brick wall. A second election did nothing to change that, but then 1933 came around, when somehow the German president Paul von Hindenburg was persuaded to make Adolf Hitler the German chancellor on January 30th, albeit with a cabinet composed of a minority of crooked crossers.
But you know how that song and dance goes.
Because all he needed was a foot in the door, and from there, a landslide of events basically locked him in place. The month he got put in charge, he bullied anyone not from his party out of power, and in February, he blamed a fire that burned down the parliament building on the communists, ousting the reputation of his biggest rivals and justifying the Enabling Act, which gave him dictator power levels. By June, he declared his party the only legal party in Germany, and on June 30th, 1934, Chancellor Shitty-Teen ordered a purge of political opponents, and ironically, the brown shirts in particular. The eventually named Night of the Long Knives resulted in the deaths of 80 people and made the SS the most feared organization in Germany. However, the president of Germany was not someone he targeted, instead waiting for him to die a few months later before proclaiming himself the supreme leader of Germany. By 1939, the war in Europe was off to the races, but the SS would not wear their black uniforms the entire time. By 1940, any deployed units had adopted gray combat uniforms and sent the black ones back for training new recruits and auxiliary police forces. Black uniforms in Italy, meanwhile, would stick around until the end of their time in the war, but the full-fledged black shirts wouldn't make it past the North African campaign, when the surrender of Italian forces in February 1941 wiped out all 6 divisions the Italians had deployed there, so almost 48,000 men.
That's a lot of dead people.
The black shirts were withdrawn from combat in 1942 because apparently their training consisted mostly of political morale. Real shocker that didn't work, so after that, some of the remaining black shirts were placed in newer M battalions. The M battalions fought everywhere the Italians were until the fall of Mussolini in 1943, fully disgracing the black shirts into oblivion. And when World War II finally ended in 1945, the era of black uniforms explicitly worn in the name of fascism came to a dead end. And that is not the end of the video, because remember, this entire conversation spawned a second question. How did a military uniform, fictitious or otherwise, become a thing that people wear because they want to, not because they have to? I don't know clothes. I mean, my entire wardrobe can be summed up as t-shirt, jeans or sweatpants, and the optional sweatshirt even in the dead of winter. That is it. And so I reached out to my friend and fellow guild creator, Nixus, who has a degree in fashion and thus knows a lot more about what people wear than I do. And that's where I found out there was actually something called military fashion.
Never in my life have I needed something so much and never known until I received it.
So down we go into this secondary rabbit hole, and I may be the history guy, but she's the fashion gal, so she's gonna take the wheel for now.
Thank you, Cap. Hey guys, I'm Nixus. Now let's go wreck this car. The decades-long process of the uniform becoming a fashion statement starts all the way back in World War II America. After being passed by Congress, the Servicemen Readjustment Act, more commonly known as the GI Bill of Rights, was signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on June 22, 1944. This new bill was designed to help veterans of the Second World War ease back into a world where fighting for their lives was done with bills and balances instead of bombs and bullets. Boring. This GI Bill guaranteed veterans their access to things like unemployment insurance, home loans, and most importantly, tuition funding for college and trade schools. And you gotta keep in mind at this point, World War II was the largest America's military had ever been. By 1945, over 12 million people were serving across all the US military's branches, Coast Guard included. And by the end of the war, over 60 million Americans had joined the armed forces ranks. Now, World War II is almost over and suddenly millions of people are able to go, which by itself was a massive culture shock. Because affording college at this point in history was a massive dream for most Americans. The peak of college enrollment in the last 10 years before this happened was in 1939, with 1.4 million college students enrolling in a single year. Meanwhile, in the first 7 years after the GI Bill was passed, over 8 million veterans would be able to attend college using the bill's benefits, and the country they were going to college in was still slowly unwinding from rationing and dedicated manufacturing of the war effort. Manufacturing plant didn't just go, oh, war's done, wrap it up, switch back everything to what we were doing before.
We can always switch back, right?
Ha! No.
As a result, clothes were either not available or stupid expensive, which was kind of a problem for these veterans because the standard collegiate attire at the time was the suit. At the end of the 1945, the New York Times reported that the garment industry would only be able to make half of the 24 million suits that were considered normal yearly production. And one store in particular being quoted as having a total stock of, get this, only 150 suits. There was even a comic essay writer for the American Legion magazine that said, after the last war, when a guy started looking for a job, he put on a clean white shirt and tried to get an appointment. Now he needed to make an appointment to try and get a white shirt. So with the absence of suits, the veteran would do what they always did.
Time to improvise.
And they went to college, best as they could, in their uniforms. However, because of how difficult it was to get into college at the time, it was typically viewed as this elite, prestigious place. And it was full of people maintaining that prestige elite look. But the veterans who couldn't buy proper suits because they were straight up not available stuck out like a sore thumb. And that attracted sarcasm, jeers, pressure of their newfound peers to try and find ways to conform to their snobby college look. For example, Stanford University was known for their male students wearing corduroy trousers, and after the influx of khaki-wearing veterans, again with no better options, their campus paper felt the need to clarify clarify that male Stanfordites are not khaki-wacky by nature. And the students could look less military by pairing their uniform with a brightly colored or loud tie and a bomber jacket. And there was the Columbia Daily Spectator newspaper, which published a guide in 1947 recommending that veterans dye their uniforms to make them either blue, dark brown, black, or bottle green, and swap out the brass buttons on the overcoat. In fact, the only thing that kept the college elites off the veterans' tails were the flight jackets and the field jackets.
Get off my tail, scuzzball!
The flight jackets fit in usually because of the brown coloring and the occasional leather material, but the field jackets fit in because the US had actually designed them based off of golf course windbreaker before World War II kicked off. But for everything else, veterans just kind of had to put up with it. Luckily for the veterans, peer criticism is just daily bread for somebody who's been literally shot at, and the lack of available clothes wasn't that big of a deal either. American World War II uniforms weren't just made to look good, they were made to work. They were more practical, more rugged, more utilitarian than any other wartime uniform, and while also being comfortable enough to wear for day-to-day activities. The ruggedness also meant that they would hold out for a while, which was nice because clothing shortages are a lot easier to work with when you don't have to buy new clothes. It also bought them time to earn respect of their peers. The time it took for the US clothing industry to recover taught these college elites why the US military had such strict code of discipline for its uniformed personnel. There are charges like adultery that can be pressed against soldiers by court-martial that civilians can't even be charged with, among other things. And that's because Uncle Sam and other military leaders over time all understood to varying capacities that a uniform only means what the person wearing it means.
Respect, Jake. Respect.
Apparently, even old, stupid mustache face figured that out, because when the SS originally started expanding in 1927, he actually went around and fired anybody who was a criminal or had drinking or gambling habits. And, as expected, the American veterans who kicked his army's ass set a really high bar. The war had gotten them used to a standard of success so total and complete that most people couldn't even fathom the drive it took to get there. They had to stick together and stay focused in those circumstances, some of which involved things going sideways so fast it'll make your head spin. Those are generally the kind of people that earn respect by being their authentic selves, and not even snobby college elites can avoid recognizing that forever. So in the span of 5 years, they go from looking down on the dirty, rugged veterans who were pretty much relying on the occasional military surplus store for new clothes to respecting them for being as, if not more, success-oriented than they were. And that respect became the catalyst for casualizing the US military look.
I thought I'd keep it casual.
While the process had been started with the soldiers themselves in 1944, the end of the war in 1945 brought a massive amount of surplus gear in. And that was so much stuff being sold off, and for so cheap that people looking at opening a surplus store of their own could go to General Services Administration or GSA auction, which is still a thing, by the way, and win enough stuff to stock an entire store. Over the course of the 50s, more and more Navy and Army surplus stores started popping up, especially around colleges, and military-looking attire became much more accessible to the average civilian. Buying surplus gear cheap also meant it could be sold cheap, allowing it to fill the market niche of bargain brand clothing. With more than 8 million college veterans over the last several years forming a natural advertisement, Hollywood singing stars also began wearing the same jackets and fatigue shirts. All this combined into a steamrolling fashion trend of secondhand military gear. Military surplus also provided rugged gear for the collegiate outdoorsmen's clubs, consequently laying the groundwork for the entire hiking, camping, and general outdoor clothing industry that we have today, embedded in places like Bass Pro Shops. Now, this is where my personal expertise gets truly tested, because I popped down in this era in a spike collar and combat boots. Now, while the late American 40s were about the post-war recovery and the 50s were about the Cold War prosperity, by the time the 60s rolled around, things had shifted dramatically in the other direction. The original military fashion trend had petered out by the end of the 50s, but in the mid-60s it started to come back in a different way. Yet again, the driving factor was the American college students, but instead of wanting to look like the American military this time, they were rebelling against it.
F this and F that. People, for some reason, well, they'd chip.
The Vietnam War had just started, which a lot of people did not want to get involved in. And even today, today, there's a lot of conversation that we should not have been there at all. As a result of that, and the eventual Kent State shooting during a clash between protesters and the National Guard, a lot of college students started caring a lot less for the American consumerist culture that had taken root in the early Cold War. In response, the American collegiate public turned away from the flashy fashion to years-old, worn-down outfits with express objective of spending as little money as possible on the American consuming machine. And ironically, military surplus was perfect for punk-style pursuers because it was cheap, rugged, reliable, and especially the olive green 107 or the OG 107 uniform. This uniform was introduced to all of the US Armed Forces branches starting in 1952 in the middle of the Korean War, but it wasn't until the years leading up to the Vietnam War that it was actually standardized. The olive green 107 color code had been selected for its ability to be an effective camouflage in its wide range of terrains while still being distinct from civilian clothing. At least at the time. There were 3 types, numbered 1, 2, and 3, with 3 being the most produced model and starting production around 1966. However, as the 1970s began, its successor entered development, the OG 507, which was effectively the same as the OG 107 Type 3, except for the fabric composition. Out with the old, in with the new, and when combined with its high production scale, the OG 107 would become wildly available in surplus stores throughout the United States, with a full uniform set going for as little as $2 at the time, or just under $17 today.
$2! $2!
As a result of the availability and durability, it began to show up in a lot of anti-war protests in the late 60s and early 70s, especially as some returning veterans would make these anti-war marches while still wearing their uniform. The popularity of the military surplus wear would spike after John Lennon, one of the Beatles, came to the Dick Cavett show in September 1971. He would discuss his observations of the anti-war movement on American television while wearing an OG 107 jacket that had been gifted to him by a Korean War veteran. Surplus, like the OG 107, would take root in those movements, but with all the other protests taking place for things like civil rights, it would soon spread to all of them. The 107s and field jackets mixed with other clothing items became a literal hodgepodge uniform code worn by people who wanted to see the world change, which started the counterculture movement. With the public newspapers reporting statements like only hippies wear military surplus, it became clear yet again that a uniform only means what the person wearing it means, even in rebellion. This subversive way of wearing the uniform and the other non-conventional clothes also eventually gained the style a name.
Punk.
Clearly meant to be an insult to the style and the punk kids with their loud and proud rebellion. In fact, it bred many terms with punk in it, whether it be punk fashion, punk rock, punk whatever, generally has its roots in rebellion against the man and everything the government tried to push for. Now, America has always been a trendsetter, but we're not the only country that started adopting this punk style of mixing military clothes with everything else. By the 1960s, the United Kingdom was really beginning to feel the impact of giving out so many Independence Days.
We've run out of options.
It was now crystal clear to the younger generation that the country was no longer the empire that they had, and economic problems were starting to become a lot more common, leading to a growing trend of secondhand military surplus clothing. But the British side of the pond had more history than the United States. As a result, one thing that caught on there that didn't in the US was a small fashion stall that started up in London's Portobello Market in 1964 called I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet, which sold military fashion and used modified World War II recruiting posters as advertisement. But their version of military fashion was unique. They specialized in uniforms from the Victorian era and earlier, some of which was in the exact same style as the ones the British wore when they took in the Black Brunswicks in early 1800s. And with the world slowly becoming more globally connected, after 1965, American anti-war sentiment began drifting its way across the ocean, especially in music. Musicians like Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, also John Lennon were seen wearing red coats that had purchased from the shop, and several photos were taken in 1967 of Jimi Hendrix, an American guitarist and former soldier, while he was wearing an unbuttoned British Hussars uniform over top of either his bare chest or a very flamboyant shirt. By the early 70s, the OG 107 uniform had reached British shores and was starting to become popular with generations of boys who preferred a more street tough yet proud working class look to the flamboyant wannabe rich upper class imitations of the previous generations who were still trying to hold on to the last strands of the glory days. Soon after, the punk movement reached the British Isles as social disconnect from the waning past of the mid-60s combined with the unemployment issues of the 70s created this general sense of being alienated by the world that they lived in. Surplus military gear was cheap and would last, making it a smart choice in an era of waning budgets, and combat boots in particular provided a lot of protection in chaotic spaces like packed concerts and protests. All the rebellion started waning down in the 80s and 90s. Traditional military fashion started coming back around thanks to the big hit movies like Top Gun and Rambo. The same bomber jacket that veterans relied on to blend in during the late 40s now became a staple next to the classic aviator sunglasses. And no, you cannot pull those glasses off. Let it die.
Never!
Now the leather jacket that was also popular at the time, that you could revive. Those in the cargo pants would mix with a punk genre along the way and be combined with studs, spikes, and chains, and overall a lot grungier look to everything. But this is where we start to see more of a professional genre that developed that went back to the traditional military roots. Those young urban professionals, or yuppies, were much more career focused, and they chose to reflect that through their outfits, especially women. The military style still exists today, but it's pretty hard to spot under all the roots and the subgenres that have grown since the internet. However, there does seem to be some predictions that military fashion might be coming back as vintage clothing, and with the internet's incessant pressure for fast fashion, and in a world with rapidly collapsing budget margins, military surplus might yet again fill that bargain brand role. Though I can personally tell you it never left this particular goth's wardrobe at all. It's an easy find at the thrift stores, easy to dye black and stylish, and great style never actually dies.
And that's it. That is the unusually cohesive timeline of how black uniforms are loosely connected to both current fashion and modern-day Germany. And now I'm tempted to go get an old German greatcoat and stitch something like America being a back-to-back World War champ on the back of it. Nazi clothes? Too bad. I'm gonna flip the script, play the communism card, and make it our clothes, and I'm gonna do it strictly to spite them. Because if you can take something good and make it mean something worse, then you can take something worse and make it mean something better. It'll just take a little longer. And nothing ruins the power of an old dictatorship better than taking what their stuff used to mean and dogpiling it with a better definition. So in summation, if I have learned anything from this brief foray into fashion today, if you're wearing a uniform, then you decide what it means. Because you're the one wearing it. And f*** Nazis, f*** critics,
And you!
Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and make sure to go check out my friend Nixis at her Twitch channel as well. And if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed. I wonder if I can combine that greatcoat with some purple.